The Admiral laughed when he saw her patch during morning inspection. "What's this, Lieutenant? Some participation trophy?" he mocked before ordering Dr. Rachel Kim off the flight deck for cluttering up a real military operation. But when the carrier's most advanced missile system suddenly required emergency authorization and every command code failed, the Admiral stopped laughing. Rachel's clearance was so classified that even he didn't know it existed, and her authorization was the only thing that could save them all. From which city around the world are you watching today? If this story moves you, please subscribe to Rising Life Stories to help us share more stories of hidden heroes. But Dr. Rachel Kim wasn't just any lieutenant. She was the lead architect of the Navy's most classified weapons system, the Aegis Quantum Defense Platform. The small patch on her collar that Admiral Morrison had mocked wasn't a participation trophy. It was a level 15 security clearance that existed in the files of only 7 people worldwide, including the President and Secretary of Defense. What the Admiral didn't know was that Rachel had designed the very missile system now threatening to malfunction. She had been sent to the USS Gerald Ford under a cover identity to conduct classified testing of her own creation. The emergency authorization protocol that was about to activate could only be overridden by its original programmer, and if Rachel's code wasn't entered within 60 seconds, the carrier's own defense system would interpret the crew as a threat and engage lethal countermeasures. The Admiral had just kicked off the one person who could save every soul on that ship. The USS Gerald Ford cut through the waters of the Pacific Ocean like a floating city of steel and purpose. At 1,106 feet long and home to over 4,500 crew members, the carrier represented the pinnacle of American naval engineering. But hidden within its classified compartments was technology that even most of the crew didn't know existed. Lieutenant Rachel Kim stepped onto the flight deck during the morning watch, her credentials identifying her as a systems analyst assigned to evaluate communication protocols. At 31, she appeared to be exactly what her fabricated service record suggested, a computer specialist with a background in network security who had been assigned to the carrier for routine technical evaluations. Her cover story was deliberately mundane. According to her official paperwork, Lieutenant Kim was conducting a 6-week assessment of the ship's communication systems to identify potential upgrades for fleet-wide implementation. She carried herself with the quiet professionalism of someone comfortable with technology, but perhaps less certain in the traditional military environment of a warship. Admiral James Morrison commanded the Gerald Ford with the kind of old-school authority that had defined his 30-year naval career. At 58, he represented a generation of officers who had risen through the ranks when naval warfare was understood in terms of conventional weapons and traditional tactics. The emerging world of cyber warfare and quantum defense systems was something he tolerated rather than embraced. Morrison noticed Lieutenant Kim immediately, not because of anything she did wrong, but because something about her presence on his flight deck irritated him. She moved with a confidence that seemed inconsistent with her supposed role as a technical observer, and her questions about the ship's systems were more sophisticated than he would expect from a routine communications analyst. "Lieutenant Kim," Morrison called out during the morning inspection, his voice carrying across the flight deck with unmistakable authority. "Step forward." Rachel approached the Admiral with the measured pace of someone accustomed to military protocol, but Morrison caught something in her bearing that suggested a level of self-assurance unusual for a junior officer meeting a flag officer for the first time. "Lieutenant, explain to me what this is," Morrison said, pointing to a small rectangular patch on Rachel's collar. The patch was discreet, so small that most people would overlook it entirely. To casual observation, it appeared to be nothing more than a geometric design in dark blue and silver. "It's a security clearance indicator, sir," Rachel replied simply. Morrison studied the patch more carefully. He had seen thousands of military insignia during his career, but this particular design was unfamiliar to him. The geometric pattern seemed almost abstract, lacking the obvious symbolism of traditional military decorations. "Security clearance for what, Lieutenant?" "Computer maintenance." Several officers within earshot chuckled at Morrison's comment. The implication was clear. Whatever clearance this junior officer possessed was probably related to routine technical work that had little relevance to real naval operations. "Classified systems, sir," Rachel answered, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the obvious dismissiveness in Morrison's tone. "Classified systems," Morrison repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "And what classified systems would those be, Lieutenant?" "The ship's email server?" More laughter from the assembled officers. Rachel remained silent, understanding that her cover story limited her ability to provide detailed explanations about her actual authority and responsibilities. Morrison stepped closer, studying the patch with the kind of attention that suggested he was building toward a larger point. "You know what this looks like to me, Lieutenant? This looks like some kind of participation trophy, something they give to computer technicians to make them feel important." The comment was calculated to humiliate Rachel in front of the ship's senior staff. Morrison had been using similar tactics for decades to establish hierarchy and remind junior officers of their place in the military structure. "I understand your perspective, sir," Rachel replied calmly. But Morrison wasn't finished. He had decided to make Lieutenant Kim an example, demonstrating to his crew the difference between real naval officers and the technical specialists who were increasingly common on modern warships. "Lieutenant Kim, I want you to understand something about this ship," Morrison announced, his voice now loud enough to carry to every officer and crew member within hearing range. "This is the USS Gerald Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world. This flight deck has launched missions that have changed the course of history. The men and women who serve here are real naval officers, people who understand combat, strategy, and the life and death decisions that define naval warfare." Rachel listened without interruption, recognizing the speech as a standard assertion of traditional military values over technological innovation. "What we don't need," Morrison continued, "is someone cluttering up a real military operation with computer analysis and technical evaluations that have nothing to do with naval combat effectiveness." The Admiral paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his conclusion. "Lieutenant Kim, you are hereby ordered to remove yourself from this flight deck, report to the communications center where your technical skills might actually be useful, and leave the real naval operations to the real naval officers." The silence that followed Admiral Morrison's order was profound. Every officer and crew member on the flight deck understood that they had just witnessed a deliberate and public humiliation designed to establish clear boundaries between traditional naval officers and technical specialists. Rachel stood motionless for several seconds, her expression showing no reaction to Morrison's dismissal. The watching officers expected to see embarrassment, anger, or the kind of defensive response that junior officers typically displayed when challenged by senior command. Instead, Rachel simply nodded. "Understood, Admiral." Her calm acceptance of the humiliation seemed to irritate Morrison even more than resistance would have. He had expected some kind of reaction that would justify his harsh treatment and reinforce his point about military hierarchy. "Is there something unclear about my order, Lieutenant?" Morrison pressed. "No, sir. The order is completely clear." Rachel turned to leave the flight deck, walking with the same measured pace she had maintained throughout the encounter. But as she moved toward the exit, she paused and looked back at Admiral Morrison. "Admiral, may I ask one question?" Morrison's expression suggested that he was not interested in questions, but military protocol required him to at least listen to what a subordinate officer wanted to say. "What is your question, Lieutenant? If there were a systems emergency requiring Level 15 authorization, who on this ship would provide that authorization?" The question was so unexpected that Morrison was momentarily taken aback. Level 15 clearance was not something that came up in routine naval operations, and the specificity of Rachel's question suggested knowledge that seemed inconsistent with her supposed role as a communications analyst. "Lieutenant, Level 15 authorization is handled through proper command channels. That's not something that concerns technical specialists." "Of course, sir. I was simply curious about emergency protocols." Morrison studied Rachel's face, trying to understand the subtext of her question. There was something about her manner that suggested she knew more than she was revealing, but he couldn't identify what that knowledge might be. "Lieutenant Kim, your curiosity about command protocols is noted. Now follow your orders and report to the communications center." Yes, sir. As Rachel left the flight deck, the assembled officers began to disperse, returning to their regular duties. Several of them exchanged glances that suggested they had found Morrison's treatment of the lieutenant to be excessive, but none were willing to challenge a flag officer's decision publicly. Commander Sarah Davis, the ship's executive officer, approached Morrison with a concerned expression. "Admiral, that was a pretty harsh dressing down for a routine technical assignment," Morrison waved dismissively. "Commander, these technical people need to understand their place on a warship. We can't have computer analysts thinking they're combat officers." "But sir, her security clearance patch. I've never seen that particular design before. It might be more significant than it appears." "Commander Davis, I've been in the Navy for 30 years. I know military insignia, and I know the difference between real authority and bureaucratic paperwork. That lieutenant is a computer technician with delusions of importance." Davis nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by Morrison's assessment. Something about Lieutenant Kim's reaction to the humiliation had seemed wrong. Too calm, too accepting, as if she knew something that Morrison didn't. Meanwhile, Rachel made her way through the carrier's corridors toward the communications center, but her real destination was far more sensitive. Hidden deep within the ship's classified sections was the control center for the Aegis quantum defense platform, the weapon system that she had spent 3 years designing and that represented the most advanced missile defense technology in military history. The system was so secret that only a handful of people on the carrier even knew it existed. Admiral Morrison was not among them. His security clearance, while substantial, did not extend to the compartmentalized world of quantum defense systems and the protocols that governed their operation. Rachel's real mission on the Gerald Ford was to conduct final testing of the AQDP before its deployment across the entire carrier fleet. The testing required careful simulation of combat scenarios and emergency protocols to ensure that the system would function perfectly when lives depended on its performance. What Rachel hadn't anticipated was that Admiral Morrison's ego and prejudices would interfere with her ability to conduct the testing discreetly. The public humiliation on the flight deck had drawn attention to her presence on the ship and potentially compromised the security of her mission. But as Rachel reached the communications center and prepared to contact her handlers at the Pentagon, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. The testing scenario that she had programmed for later in the day was activating ahead of schedule, triggered by a glitch in the system's autonomous protocols. Within seconds, every officer and crew member on the USS Gerald Ford would understand that their lives depended on authorization codes that only one person on the ship possessed, the same person who had just been publicly humiliated and ordered off the flight deck. The first alarm was subtle, a low electronic tone that most crew members initially dismissed as routine system maintenance. But within 30 seconds, that tone was joined by others, creating a cascade of warnings that indicated something far more serious than a routine drill. On the flight deck, Admiral Morrison was reviewing the morning's flight operations when his communication officer approached with an expression of growing concern. "Admiral, we're receiving priority alerts from the Weapons Control Center," Commander Lisa Park announced. "The Aegis system is showing anomalous readings." Morrison looked up from his paperwork with the kind of irritation that suggested he viewed technical problems as unwelcome interruptions to real naval operations. "Commander Park, define anomalous readings. Are we talking about a calibration issue or an actual systems malfunction?" Before Park could respond, the ship's general alarm began sounding, the unmistakable tone that indicated all personnel should prepare for emergency stations. Within moments, the Gerald Ford's 4,500 crew members would be moving to battle positions in response to what appeared to be a critical threat. "Admiral," Park continued, her voice now carrying obvious urgency, "the Aegis quantum defense platform is reporting an unauthorized activation. The system is interpreting current conditions as a hostile environment and is preparing to engage defensive countermeasures." Morrison stared at Park as if she had spoken in a foreign language. "Commander, what the hell is the Aegis quantum defense platform?" The question revealed the gap between Morrison's traditional understanding of naval warfare and the classified technologies that were increasingly integrated into modern warships. The AQDP was so secret that even flag officers were briefed on its existence only when operationally necessary. Sir, it's a classified weapon system. Level 15 clearance required for operational details. Level 15? Morrison's expression showed recognition as he remembered Lieutenant Kim's seemingly irrelevant question from just minutes earlier. Commander, who on this ship has Level 15 clearance? Park consulted her tablet, accessing security databases that were normally restricted to the most sensitive operations. Admiral, according to the system records, there's only one person currently aboard with Level 15 authorization. Who? Lieutenant Rachel Kim, sir. The implications hit Morrison like a physical blow. The junior officer he had just humiliated and ordered off the flight deck was apparently the only person on the ship capable of dealing with whatever crisis was now unfolding. Get Lieutenant Kim to the bridge immediately, Morrison ordered. But before Park could respond, the ship's automated voice system activated, a calm mechanical announcement that carried throughout every compartment of the carrier. Attention all personnel. The Aegis quantum defense platform has detected hostile intent and is activating protective countermeasures. All crew. Members must remain in current positions while identity verification protocols are completed. Failure to comply with identity. Verification may result in automated defensive response. Morrison looked around the flight deck with growing alarm as he began to understand the magnitude of the situation. The ship's own defense system was treating the crew as potential threats, and without proper authorization, those defensive measures could become lethal. Commander Park, explain to me what automated defensive response means in this context. Park's face had gone pale as she read from her tablet. Admiral, if the system cannot verify that current personnel are authorized to be aboard this vessel, it will interpret their presence as a boarding attempt by hostile forces. And then what happens? Sir, the AQDP is designed to eliminate hostile boarders using any means necessary. That includes lethal force, sir. Morrison felt his stomach drop as he realized that his decision to humiliate Lieutenant Kim might have just endangered every person on the ship. The weapon system was apparently sophisticated enough to carry out its defensive mission automatically, without regard for the traditional command structure that Morrison understood. How long do we have before this system decides we're hostile? Park checked her readings again. The identity verification protocol allows 60 seconds for proper authorization, sir. We have 43 seconds remaining. Across the flight deck, other officers were beginning to understand the crisis. The ship's most advanced defense system was about to turn against its own crew, and the only person who could prevent that catastrophe was a junior officer who had been publicly dismissed and ordered away from the operational center of the ship. Commander Park, where is Lieutenant Kim right now? Sir, according to ship's records, she reported to the communications center as ordered. But Admiral, even if we can locate her immediately, I don't know if she can reach the weapons control center in time to enter the authorization codes. Morrison's mind raced through the possibilities. In less than 40 seconds, the Gerald Ford would either be saved by the technical specialist he had mocked, or every soul aboard would face the lethal consequences of his prejudice and pride. All units, this is Admiral Morrison, he announced over the ship's communication system. Locate Lieutenant Rachel Kim immediately and escort her to weapons control with maximum priority. This is a ship-wide emergency. But even as he gave the order, Morrison understood that time was running out, and the fate of everyone aboard now depended on the woman whose authority he had questioned and whose expertise he had dismissed as irrelevant to real naval operations. Rachel Kim was already moving toward the weapons control center when Admiral Morrison's emergency announcement echoed through the ship's corridors. She had been monitoring the AQDP's status remotely and had realized that the system's autonomous activation protocol was proceeding faster than her original programming had intended. The testing scenario she had designed was supposed to simulate a hostile boarding situation, allowing her to evaluate the system's response patterns under controlled conditions. But a software glitch had accelerated the timeline, creating a real emergency from what should have been a routine evaluation. As Rachel reached the weapons control center, she could hear Admiral Morrison's voice over the ship's communication system, ordering all personnel to locate her with maximum priority. The irony was profound. The same officer who had humiliated her for not belonging on his ship was now desperately trying to find her to save it. The weapons control center was a restricted area that most of the ship's crew never saw. Behind multiple security doors and biometric scanners lay the nerve center of the Gerald Ford's most advanced defensive systems. Rachel's security clearance granted her access to areas that even Admiral Morrison couldn't enter without special authorization. 20 seconds remaining for identity verification, the automated system announced throughout the ship. Rachel approached the main control console and placed her hand on the biometric scanner. The system immediately recognized her as Dr. Rachel Kim, Lead Systems Architect, Aegis Quantum Defense Platform, with Level 15 security clearance and full operational authority. 15 seconds remaining. Rachel began entering the complex authorization sequence that would identify the current crew as friendly forces and cancel the defensive protocol. The code was 64 characters long and had to be entered with perfect accuracy to prevent any possibility of unauthorized access. 10 seconds remaining. On the flight deck, Admiral Morrison and his officers waited in stunned silence as the countdown continued. Every person aboard the Gerald Ford understood that their lives now depended on the technical skills of the junior officer who had been dismissed as irrelevant to naval operations. 5 seconds remaining. Rachel completed the authorization sequence and pressed the final confirmation key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ship's automated voice system made a new announcement. Identity verification complete. All current personnel confirmed as authorized. Defensive countermeasures canceled. Aegis Quantum Defense Platform returning to standby status. The alarm stopped. The emergency lighting returned to normal. And throughout the Gerald Ford, 4,500 crew members continued breathing because of authorization codes that only one person aboard had been qualified to enter. Admiral Morrison stood on the flight deck in stunned silence as the implications of what had just happened became clear. The woman he had humiliated as a computer technician with delusions of importance had just saved every life on his ship using authority and expertise that exceeded his own. Commander Park approached Morrison with obvious hesitation. "Admiral, Lieutenant Kim is requesting permission to return to the flight deck to brief you on the AQDP testing protocols." Morrison nodded, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. "Send her up immediately." When Rachel arrived on the flight deck, she carried herself with the same quiet professionalism that had irritated Morrison earlier. But now the composure took on a different meaning. This was not the uncertainty of a junior officer, but the confidence of someone who had just demonstrated mastery over systems that most people couldn't even comprehend. "Admiral Morrison," Rachel said, "I need to inform you that what just occurred was a scheduled testing scenario that experienced an autonomous acceleration due to a software anomaly. The Aegis Quantum Defense Platform performed exactly as designed, but the timeline was compressed beyond safe parameters." Morrison stared at Rachel, struggling to reconcile the woman standing before him with his assumptions about her role and qualifications. "Lieutenant Dr. Kim," Morrison said, using her proper title for the first time, "I owe you an apology, and I owe this crew a debt of gratitude." Rachel nodded professionally. "Admiral, the testing is complete. My mission aboard the Gerald Ford is concluded. I'll be transferring off the ship at the next port." "Dr. Kim," Morrison said, "would you mind explaining to me what that patch on your collar actually represents?" Rachel looked down at the small geometric design that Morrison had mocked as a participation trophy just hours earlier. "It's the insignia for Level 15 security clearance, Admiral. It indicates authority over classified weapon systems that are essential to national defense. There are currently 7 people in the world authorized to wear this patch." Morrison felt the full weight of his mistake. He had spent 30 years in the Navy believing he understood military hierarchy and the importance of different roles within naval operations. But the emergence of quantum defense systems and classified technologies had created levels of authority and responsibility that existed outside his traditional understanding. 6 months later, Admiral Morrison implemented new protocols requiring all senior officers to receive briefings on classified systems aboard their vessels, regardless of their traditional clearance levels. The incident with Dr. Rachel Kim had demonstrated that modern naval warfare required understanding technologies that went far beyond conventional military training. Dr. Kim returned to her position at the Pentagon, where she continued developing the next generation of defensive systems that would protect American naval forces. Her patch remained as small and discreet as ever, but those who knew its meaning understood they were in the presence of someone whose expertise was vital to national security. At Rising Life Stories, we believe that expertise often hides behind humble appearances. Rachel Kim's quiet professionalism masked capabilities that literally saved thousands of lives, and her story reminds us that the most important qualifications aren't always the most visible ones. Where are you watching from today? If this story of hidden expertise and ultimate vindication inspired you, please subscribe, because there are heroes working in classified worlds whose contributions to our safety will never be fully known or appreciated.